Hello, hello. Say hello to OBS, to Open Broadcast Software or whatever it's called. Anyway, welcome back everyone to another Victoria 2 thing. Um, this time the lovely folks at Paradox decided to release the Victoria Free Viconomics PDF. Don't ask me. Um, Nice font. No, fuck off. Nice font, by the way. So basically, what's going on here is that they've decided to release this little PDF with basically their economic vision for the game or whatever. It's just like 13 pages. We're gonna quickly take a look at it, although not sure how quick it's going to be. Anyway, nice quote at the beginning. So basically they're talking about what they want to do. Now keep in mind that what they said is that this is going to be a simulation, in fact. So yeah, it better be simulative and, and realistic, because if you're going to be talking about a simulation, well, let's dive right into it. Basically, scale. Here we go. It says we have 1 billion people at the game start, which is true. That's roughly the population in the early 1800s. Roughly, I say, because censuses weren't a thing for most countries. We're of 800 million in subsistence economies, which is, this is going to be a mechanic clearly where they're going to have most of the population at the beginning in subsistence agriculture, and the rest sort of integrated into the market system, working in the factories or in real agriculture, quote unquote. Now, as you can see, I decided to write up a gigantic fucking thing over here because, as we said, this is a simulation, and so, or it's supposed to be. So, reading that 800 million part in subsistence economy got me thinking, wait, I wonder if they're like just winging it and just like type the random number, or if this is based on like any research. So this basically, I just wanted to like quickly look into it, and then that turned into like several hours of just like reading random shit. Now, warning, professional warning: I am not a demographer. I am not a economist. And I did not have the time to thoroughly research exactly how many people in the world at the beginning of the 19th century could be calculated as a subsistence farmer or living in a subsistence economic environment. But I tried anyway because fuck you. Now, Paradox has had like 2 years or something to develop this, so they've had more time to research this. It's likely that if they've done any research, they're right. But let's just very, very quickly look at what I've found now, which should also be like a nice example as to like if Paradox want to represent, like, for example, prices of goods, again, population data, economic data at the beginning of the game, and sort of how it progresses throughout the game. They're going to need to do this kind of research, and I wonder if they're up to it, because to be honest, in Hearts of Iron 4, the research part was fairly lacking in terms of like the making the game historically accurate. Anyway, we have roughly 1 billion people, right? So what the hell is a subsistence farming, like a subsistence economy? Now, obviously, you may know that before industrialization, people didn't work normal jobs like we do right now in exchange for wages. What they did was, for the most part, farm the land and eat what came out of that. That's subsistence farming. And the basic characteristic of this economic sort of state and form is that you do not very much interact with sort of the wider market outside of maybe like your village or whatever. In fact, for like a lot of world history, most people didn't really use even that much money, even though there were currency economies. It wasn't, like the Roman Empire already wasn't a barter economy. Like the fucking Assyrian Empire wasn't a barter economy, and yet most people didn't like regularly pay with money for things, because most people were farmers, of whom, in these ancient societies, a good amount would have been slaves or something akin to that. And in the medieval period, you have, serfdom and sort of tiny family plots of land being cultivated by these small groups of people. Now this varies between different like geographic regions. Like, for example, the like family plot is more common in northern France, while England had the sort of common lands that were worked by villages. It's kind of complex, but generally speaking, the land was owned by aristocracy, who sort of got paid in taxes most of the time in kind by their peasants. This was, what we call the Middle Ages, what we call subsistence economy. And everything above that, the sort of market economy that was developing, was mostly relegated to, the agricultural surplus that would be sold to cities or to people working in like cottage industries, I suppose, which it's kind of a simplification, but yeah, basically, so people in cities and, artisans and miners and everyone who isn't a farmer is fed with the agricultural surplus of these farmers, and thus creates the market. Now, very, very slowly, throughout the sort of centuries, the people that were at the top accumulating sort of the wealth that was being extracted by or from the peasantry eventually were able to basically accumulate enough capital to sort of jumpstart what we would call today industrial enterprises, and also gobble up sort of more land to form what we today would call like, not industrial farming, that comes afterwards, but like capitalistic farming. Very, very shortly, that's like the economic history of the world, right? Well, in 1836, much of that in a lot of the world hasn't happened yet. It has only happened in a few countries. So basically, you do not need to like trust me on this. Like, this is pretty much economics. How do we quantify the total population connected to the world market? And is 200 million an accurate number? So as we said, everyone who lives in a city, by definition, is not a subsistence farmer. Now, for most of human history, that number was probably less than like 5%. When you have a relatively developed agricultural system and the beginnings of industrialization, that very quickly goes up to like 10%-ish. And then it skyrockets, basically, as industry sort of booms. And it's, in the period in which basically labor is cheap and plentiful, because the increase in productivity in the agricultural economy means that gradually less and less people are required to grow enough food for everyone. And also, as capital accumulation, aka the rich getting richer, basically means that they can buy up more land, and therefore you have less independent farmers that are sort of able to get by on their own, and they're having to either work as laborers under the new owners of the land, or they need to migrate to a city. Therefore, everyone in a city increases very, very quickly, very, very, very quickly. And that cheap labor, because you have a lot of people, therefore, a lot of people who are willing to, sell their labor for very, very cheap, means that industry sort of grows very, very rapidly. So you have a few decades where that 10% number of people who live in cities goes up and up and up and up and up. And eventually, like in the modern day, we have 95%, or actually more like 80 to 90%, depending on country, in like what we would call like advanced high income economies, living in cities, but actually like the agricultural labor force is like 3 to 5%. So of those like 10 to 20% that live in the countryside, most of those people are actually commuting over to cities, basically, because they just want to live somewhere else. So the trend is towards the vast majority of human beings living in cities, but it hasn't gotten to that point yet. Anyway, everyone who doesn't work in agriculture, because even though like not everyone lives in a city, isn't a farmer. So you have again sort of township industries, cottage industries. You have mining. You have traditional handicrafts, all those kinds of things. This is like very important in a like very, very specific like time frame in history, and then it becomes basically uncompetitive compared to industrial production, which is like what happens to artisans in Victoria too. They just like they all start not being able to afford goods because their production is uncompetitive compared to industrial goods. And then you have like farmers that are not subsistence farmers. So everyone who relies on monetary income and market dynamics for survival. This is something that I wrote up. Maybe like if you look in like Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever, it's going to have a slightly different definition. But that's basically about it. So instead of like me growing my grain and my vegetables and like having my animals and then eating that, I go sell my crops and then I buy shit back. And I buy my food that way, which is like what happens today in industrialized agriculture. The farmer sells his produce and then buys the goods. So that's a market economy because you have currency circulation. Anyway, we have so the first that is rather easy to see is like how many people are in cities. The first like little data point. In 1800, by the way, I'm gonna post like sources for all of this stuff down in the pinned comment, or if I forget, please remind me. Roughly, world urbanization in a projection was something like 7.3% in 1800. So by projection, it's 8% ish in 1830. So 1836 when the game starts. So that with a 1 billion people, that means 80 million-ish people who live in cities. These people are already part of that 200 million that is not subsistence economy. These people are integrated with the market. Okay. What countries then, and then of course everyone who doesn't work in agriculture but lives in the countryside is it's pretty complex. There's a guy who, a researcher who published quite a few papers on this, and I took data for Europe of essentially non-agricultural but rural dwellers, and that's gonna be down below. You're gonna see later like the amount of people that comes up for Europe, which is where that primarily comes into play, although we'll get to that later. And then for farmers, we need to see like what countries had non-subsistence agriculture, so like large scale capitalistic agriculture. I say few, but like it's basically almost none. And I just I even left a little note for myself. I have this which is again from one of those papers that I'm gonna link down below. I have this nice little graph. Now, what the fuck is this? Basically, this is this like okay. Wouldn't be bad to like have a decent looking color. So this is a graph that is output per worker in Mediterranean and Northwestern European agriculture, 1300 to 1800. Now, this is basically based on like I couldn't like actually 100% like read everything in that paper, but this is basically based on agricultural yield projections, although that's actually a fairly like studied element of agricultural production per divided by essentially agricultural population estimates across again these various European countries or regions throughout this time period from the 14th to the 19th century. So obviously what interests us is this 1800 mark, because that's not really all that much has changed between 1800 and 1836, although some countries like France down here have changed quite a bit. Most of the other ones are on the same trends as we see portrayed in the graph. So what do we see here? We see that this little square, which is England, which is actually used as a point of reference here. This one is the productivity per worker in England in 1500. Basically, you can see that England at some point after the 1600s basically shoots up and goes all the way to like 60% more productivity. Then it dips down, and it's going to go back up all the way to, infinity or whatever. So this is basically what happens when you have this increase in agricultural productivity. And this has a sort of double whammy, because this pushes people into cities, right? Because you need less people per sort of hectare of land to get the same amount of yield. So if the land doesn't change and, cultivated land basically at some point is going to run out, then this drives urbanization, and it also drives, it also drives sort of marketization of agriculture. So this is what causes people to not be subsistence agriculture. So we can see that England, and the X over here is the Netherlands, which had a sort of similar trajectory. They were like pretty productive, but then at some point it just like went up, right? So England and the Netherlands is mostly commercial, modern, high productivity agriculture. So that's that. And we can see that the rest of Europe basically isn't, because their agriculture, even in like at the beginning of the century, is as productive or less than what it was centuries earlier. In other words, life hadn't changed all that much. Production techniques hadn't changed all that much. The land obviously was still the same. Population maybe had increased, but that population increase hadn't resulted in substantial productivity increases. Basically, if they were working more, they were maybe working more land, but they weren't working it more efficiently. Maybe the crops hadn't particularly been, improved or whatever. Even though this is the time when we have New World crops sort of coming back into Europe. You have the potatoes sort of spreading all over the place. And what are these countries that are like basically like stuck down here at a low productivity agriculture? Well, we have, unfortunately for me, Italy, which is this like rhombus shape. We have Spain, obviously very similar to Italy in many regards, and even France, although France, when I do my final calculation, I actually count a bit of France as like market agriculture, because France is a massive country and is very, very different between its constituent parts. And then you've got Belgium that's just sitting up here. So basically what we have is that like market economics had spread to the countryside in the early parts of the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, only to like really England plus Scotland. Now, Ireland also had a basically like a market agriculture that was integrated with the rest of the UK, but actually it really shouldn't have, because if you go ahead and look at the like what caused the potato famine, and in large part it is because a lot of like what causes the famine part of the potato famine is that like Ireland had a massive agricultural surplus, and a lot of that was being like cheaply exported to mainland England. So yeah, it had technically a market agriculture, only perhaps it really shouldn't have. So I'm counting England plus Scotland, and so we're gonna need to find the population figures for England plus Scotland. And even though at the time it wasn't like a fully like there was still like pockets of subsistence agriculture left, I'm just gonna, for simplicity's sake, count the entire population. Then the USA, even though again that's a very very complex picture because you have the frontier regions, and you have the plantation economy down south. So you have a bunch of weird economic forms sort of mashing together in the USA. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to count it in the Netherlands and part of Belgium, a small portion of France, because again, like far northern France is in conditions that are more similar to the Netherlands and Belgium than anywhere else. The Ile-de-France region also, pretty integrated with the capital. And then you had different conditions in different areas of the country. I'm not a France pre-industrial expert in any sense of the word, but it did count a few French people into that like total number of European people who are, integrated into the sort of wider market. So we have, at that moment, we had like around 15 million people in Great Britain. Perhaps a bit more, but like the English census before the like 1850s is really shit, apparently, which is one of the weird things that you discover. Plus you had 8 million Irish, but again, I'm not counting them. 15 million Americans. So we have a 30 million count, of whom 7 million were in cities. Of course, I need to subtract that because I had already counted in 80 million urbanites. That 7 million comes from a 30% urbanization rate in England and a 10% in the USA, which kind of tells you that in the 1830s, England was already like 3 decades earlier than America. England was, in many ways, already very modern, but like a very modern society in, even in the first half of the 19th century. If you go ahead and look at the difference between the urbanization rates in England and like the rest of the world, it is like quite staggering, although the USA does catch up very, very quickly. So yeah, you have that 80 million plus this 23 million, that's 103 million. So that's half of these 200 million, guys. Let's go through the rest very, very quickly. So is the 200 million accurate? We need to find 100 more million.
A glorious victory, comrade.
Right. We need to find out what other sort of 100 million people who fit those criteria. Can we find them? Well, I count 47-ish million people from the rest of Europe. Now, this is a very, 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 very unscientific calculation. Basically sort of napkin stuff. I basically took a paper that had sort of calculated how many non-agricultural laborers and how many urban laborers and how many agricultural laborers there were in Europe. That one went with its database all the way to 1800. So I was like, oh shit. Then I decided to do something that is not very scientifically correct, but for the sake of quickness and not going insane, I did it. And I basically took the population, factored in the change, and then factored in like the population growth for those like 30-40 years, with another data set that actually had how much that population had grown. So this is not scientific, but like generally, before industrialization, people in cities were they're between 5 to 10%, and non-agricultural workers who live in the countryside are 10 to 30% of the total workforce, depending on the country. For example, Austria-Hungary had a significantly higher proportion of them than a lot of other countries. Can't exactly tell you why, but I would guess that it is because Austria-Hungary, before its industrial development, had a very, very protection. Yeah, that kind of like still mercantilistic economy, so it had a lot of protectionism, and it was very reliant on sort of traditional handicrafts, traditional artisans, and also it had a lot of various mining industries. But yeah, can't tell you more than that. But like another country that had a lot of these was Poland. Now, what's kind of a problem is that all this data was on Europe, so we're missing like the Ottoman Empire that had a lot of significant urban concentrations. Mexico, Mexico City and plantation economy. South America, again, plantation economy. So really, there's like a few million people that should be coming in from this. And East Asia, and also Russia, but like Russia at this moment in time was like almost 100% like subsistence farming, except like a tiny urban minority and a few tiny like a few tiny exceptions essentially. And this is where the big elephant in the room comes in, which is China. Now you may know that I love to ramble on about China. But we already have like this fucking insane thing, right? And the same guy, Robert C. Allen, helpfully in a different study, goes ahead and inserts the Yangtze Delta in this like output per worker in agriculture graph. And the Yangtze Delta is this line. Essentially, compared to medieval Europe, the Yangtze Delta, which was one of the most advanced, but like we could say probably the most advanced, the richest Chinese region from, I guess we could say like from the southern Song, from the 13th century, all the way to, well, today actually. It basically was significantly richer than most of Europe. It was significantly more productive in its agriculture than most of Europe, and most research done on it on the economy of Imperial China agrees that such regions generally were way ahead of the curve when it comes to the sort of commercialization of agriculture. So we run into a bit of a problem, because then that would mean that there should be a like gigantic fucking market in China, right? And it is true that there was, but we run into some issues because then to calculate exactly how many Chinese people were connected to the market, it becomes difficult, because there were roughly 400 million Chinese people in 1836, and this is actually something that comes up very like the awareness of just how many Chinese people there were was actually fairly deeply rooted in the Western people that were going to China at the time. And basically you have a lot of these, like it was 1/3 of the human race was the sort of expression that came up over and over again. There was like all these people, like in the Opium Wars period, they were like English soldiers or officers going in, and they were like, well, we're about to go in and basically conquer 1/3 of the human race, because that they thought that they were going to turn it into a second India. Slash the merchants that were going there were like, oh wow, there's like 300 or 400 million people over here. The commercial sort of advantages to be the first into this market will be great. Or you had the missionaries being like, fully 1/3 of the children of the Lord or whatever do not know Jesus. We must like go in and Christianize them. So yeah, basically we have that 4/5 of those were farmers. And I say these were slightly above subsistence level because the 1800s were not the richest period in China's sort of economic fortunes. Now, this productivity, this high productivity in certain regions did not result historically in further sort of capital accumulation, intensive development of the countryside, and later down the line, sort of more intensive urbanization and later industrialization. Otherwise, we'd be speaking Chinese right now. That did not happen. China fell behind eventually. Why this has like 700 trillion answers and reasons, and we can't answer it right now. Otherwise, I'd be God, and I'd be already, I'd be like the most famous historian and economist on Earth. But very, very basically, and to oversimplify, gigantic population growth out of a period of like sort of plenty in the 18th century basically impacted productivity because China has a sort of shortage of agricultural land compared to total land mass and compared to population. The fact that it has like intensive irrigation and this very, very high nutrient crop rice basically mean that it can feed more people with less workable arable land. Therefore, when the population increases massively, you have, at least this has been like the wisdom for a long time now. This is a kind of oversimplification as to the like macroeconomics of China, but it seems that China basically ran out of land because there were too many people. And so even once you start to cultivate like the sort of second-rate land that's not as productive, eventually you run out and you just have more and more people per square hectare or square meter of land, and basically all that agricultural surplus that you had before basically goes down because it's then like necessary for people to eat, and this in part causes the like sort of catastrophes that China undergoes in the 19th century, primarily the giant rebellions, especially the Taiping and Yan rebellions that racked the country. It doesn't directly like cause all of this, and it's not like the solution to all of the puzzle of why China was, why China suffered this like disastrous century, but it is like the best guess of a lot of people, and it's like the general historical consensus. We have to summarize. Therefore, you see that like even 100 years later, you see the average land was actually this is like a direct quote, was actually cultivated by an individual farming family, owner or tenant, was very small. So beyond a certain point, larger owners, the landlords, found it preferable to let their excess land rather than farm it with hired labor. This, of course, drives down the productivity of the entire system, which is why I decide in this calculation to ignore the Chinese rural population, even though in certain areas, and certain areas with Chinese numbers, so probably a couple, like maybe like a dozen million people, 20 million people possibly were somewhat integrated into the market despite being farmers, but I decide to not count them, also because 1/5 of the population, this 1/5 of the population over here, which is 80 million, is basically the other fifth of this 4/5 of the labor force agriculture. Now, labor force does not directly correlate to population, so you have a slightly higher number, which I'm gonna be like, all right, I'm going to accept a slightly higher number, and that's hopefully going to somewhat compensate the fact that I'm just ignoring some, a lot of farmers who were legitimately quite rich. Basically, China's just super complex, and I have no goddamn idea how they're going to be able to, portray it accurately in this great simulation. Anyway, yeah, basically, I got 56 million in the end because 24 million-ish people were in cities because China had at that moment an urbanization rate of probably 6% is the general consensus. Some people say 3%, some people say 10, even up to 10%, which is definitely too high, but 6-ish% seems to be the medium, which were obviously already counted in those 80 million people before. So we come out with 56 million. Therefore, the 103, which was, if you'll recall, 80 million urbanites plus 23 million people in in developed countries, basically. So the Netherlands, Belgium, the United States, and the Great Britain, that part of the UK, plus this 56 million Chinese people equals 159 million people, so 160. Therefore, I have no goddamn clue where they got this 200 million. Now, maybe they have better sourcing than me. Maybe, I did a day of research on this. They maybe did 2 years. And I'm not going to go in as much depth for anything else in this video, but this is just to show you, there's just a ridiculous amount of shit that you need to take into account if you want Victoria Free to be, somewhat accurate to, real world demographics or demography and economics, right? Now, the incognitas, as I said, are the Ottoman Empire, some parts of Central and South America, and with East Asia, we've looked at China, but there's also the Japan conundrum, and yeah, basically, since I am very, very ignorant when it comes to Japan, I just decided to ignore it. But it is possible that if you had just a few million people here and there. Also, there's I decided to just completely ignore agricultural laborers in all of Europe, except in some areas you already had a commercial agriculture. As I said, I factored in a bit of French people, but if we were to be completely scientifically accurate, we would need to factor in some Austrians, some Hungarians, some Czechs, and also some Italians, because Italy was, much like France, very, very, very differentiated in terms of development levels between its various regions. So you had the northeastern part, or the far northeastern part, that was really, really poor, but basically already in a market economy, just very, very early stages. You had the Northwest, which was incredibly rich. You had the Po Valley in general, which was rich. You had Tuscany, which was rich. And then you had everything else that was kind of not having a good moment. So yeah, this is basically just one stat that can kind of fuck up the historical accuracy of the game a lot. It seems to be relatively accurate, but let's just hope that the Victoria 2 development team is actually doing research, Anyway, and that they're not beaten by a random Italian who decided to look at random data and studies for a few hours. Anyway, we have 750 states belonging to 140 plus markets. Pretty good. 500 billion pounds of GDP at the game start, most of it in the private sector. I just decided to type bruh because I have no idea where they got this little, where they got this data, and to be honest, I couldn't bother to look and do the same thing as I did for population. Anyway, there's gonna be a bunch of building types, a bunch of goods types, and updated all the time. Not sure if this means like they're going to expand. They're gonna patch the beta build and increase the variety of goods and buildings, or whether or not I don't know, the values in game are going to be scaling up depending on I don't know. I don't fucking give a shit. Anyway, production and consumption. This is a fairly interesting screen. You have buildings such as textile mills and wheat farms produce and often use various goods. Basically, this is like in Victoria 2. States are limited in what type of resource industries they support. This is even better than Victoria 2, in fact, because in Victoria 2 you have that a single province only has one resource gathering operation. We need to see, because Paradox has a history of shitty resource placement. What do I mean? Like, for example, in Hearts of Iron 4, when the game released, China just didn't have any resources for some fucking reason, and a lot of rubber producing regions were just completely ignored, and 100% of the world's rubber was produced in Malaya and Indonesia. In general, yeah, and in Victoria 2, half of China produces tea. Yeah, okay, I don't know. Pops consume goods to maintain their wealth. This is the needs system in Victoria 2, but better because it's not as esoteric, essentially. And government buildings obviously consume goods as well. You also have infrastructure playing a part, which your rivers. This is very interesting. I like how rivers is mentioned, because I remember in my speculation on the screenshots, I was like, I wonder if rivers are going to be like railways or highways, sort of, if they're going to be modeling in navigable rivers, and it kind of looks like they will. This would be very, very epic and based, in my opinion. Ports, railways, bringing the world closer together. That sounds very corporate. Now, markets are regions in which goods are freely traded. This is kind of interesting because it hints that, within a single market, essentially prices are going to be driven down, because you're not going to have, tariffs or to set up import and export routes as we saw in that system. If that particular country is under your market sphere, because the markets, as I learned, are replacing spheres, which I liked spheres, but I also liked the way that the markets, or at least I like the concept of the markets, with how countries are going to be trying to vie for influence within different markets and sort of try to economically map paint, was the expression that I saw someone use. Anyway, pricing. Every single good will have different pricing, and I love this because, holy shit, prices are based on, this is confirmed, prices are based on individual markets. Based. Cringe. Basically, why do I say this? Because fruit in the American market. Look at this. State, region, American market, usage. So this price is specific to a single market. This is pretty epic, because it used to be that prices were just 100% global, and even in the very, very much more globalized economy of today, because a lot of people say globalized only with only referring to the post World War II economy. They say globalization as if it's something new, but Marx in the 1840s was talking about world as well, at least the translation that I saw in my language would translate to English as worldization. It's the economy is becoming more and more uniform globally, and that leads to more interdependence and more exchange happening on a wider scale. And some historians even like see earlier globalizations. For example, some people call the late Bronze Age a like miniature globalized and like world in the area of the sort of greater Middle East, from Afghanistan to the sort of central Mediterranean. This is based on like the fact that they found basically like tin and like minerals that they could date, or that they not that they could date, but like that people who analyze this sort of stuff, I guessing chemists or geologists or metallurgists could like identify that this comes from actually Afghanistan, because the mineral is that kind of quality that is only found there. And they found
Glorious victory,
okay,
comrade.
and they found like pottery from Crete, all the way in India or whatever, right? But today we definitely have a like much more globalized and interconnected and interdependent global economic system than before all these industrial revolutions. And Victoria 2 is about the first and the second industrial revolutions, so having a world market that has perfectly synchronized prices all over the globe doesn't really make any sense. So this is perfect. This is great. States of poor, another thing that I really like, states of poor market access to underdeveloped infrastructure suffer adverse local prices. Much better than Victoria 2 soy face, as in like, I'm like, oh, I'm just like, going soy, like beast. Price is everything. Now, underproduced goods are expensive and make you reliant on imports. Overproduced goods are cheap to buy, but unprofitable to make. Ooga booga This is like, my comment on this is just ooga booga economics 101. Vuvuzela iPhone, 100 billion dead, free market bootstraps, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, economic freedom index, basic economics. Like, all right, this is like the first thing that you like tell your child when the child asks, "What is economics?" When there's when there's not a lot of things, they are expensive. I don't know why. Like, with everything else being like pretty like reasonable and high level, these two sentences for some reason just like sounded really like simplistic to me. But whatever. I don't know. We have a nice UI over here for pop needs. Now, yeah, the needs are the needs that go into wealth. As I said, the system looks to be a little bit better than in Victoria 2. Leftover money builds wealth and standard of living, basically allowing for accumulation, I suppose. Now, I have no idea exactly how the Victoria 2 engine like handles accumulation. I know that pops like get money, but like that a lot of the times doesn't really translate over to like investment, so it's kind of weird. So hopefully this system is going to be a little bit better at telling pops, hey, look, you got money, spend it. Improving standard of living leads to increased population growth, because obviously, understandable. And turns pop into loyalists. Worsening conditions turns pops into radicals. Accelerationism. Now you can see that, for example, basic food expenses for 7.35 thousand, so 7,350 Dixie farmers. Another thing is that culture is confirmed in the game, because Dixie farmers, the South will rise again. I don't know, my Southern American accent is terrible, I know. Yeah, you have your, I'm not sure why some of these are in like gray currency and some of these are gold currency. I don't know. It says groceries, so maybe this means that it's like a processed good. while these ones are all like raw material. No fucking idea. Anyway, you've got your grain. It tells you how much grain it wants to, or this pop needs. It tells you how much that costs. Then it adds up all the cost into a total cost, and then maybe at some like on another like little part, it's gonna tell you how much the income of this pop is. Which, yeah, I'm liking it. The UI is definitely better than in Victoria 2, but to be honest, that really doesn't like Victoria 2 in terms of UI readability is not a very high bar to go over. So yeah, it also gives you a nice breakdown of expenditures for for your pops, or at least for certain for a certain expenditure. For example, the standard of living expenditures, we need clothes, furniture, and services, and these make up that amount of total expenditures. I like that. Now, what the fuck? Why did I just like write bad image cropping? Holy shit. Yeah, that's actually some pretty terrible image cropping. I could do better, and I'm famously terrible at cropping images. Well, what the fuck is this jagged thing? It's your fucking presentation PDF paradox. Come on. Wages. So privately owned buildings have full control over their wages and try to maximize their profits. Damn. That's pretty sad. Except it's realistic. Countries control government and military wages. So basically, literally like in Victoria, too. Which benefit different parts of their society. And this is basically just the deep state, Yeah. Government subsidies guarantee a good wage to keep production high, and that's Vuvuzela because, government subsidies, blah, 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 communism. Yeah. Another, yeah, if you want to read this rant over here, pause and read it. Because, I like how in the logging camp over here, the capitalists have a wage of £20 per year, while the average one is 4. And I'm like, I feel like the capitalists should be getting more money for this to be realistic. And if you want to read my depressed rant, just pause and read it. But my depressed, yeah, whatever. Anyway, tax your economy in various ways to make money for the treasury. Obviously, taxes. Everyone loves taxes except the libertarians. You have your poll taxes, Margaret Thatcher, per head. Obviously, the shittiest tax on earth, the biggest dick move when it comes to taxes. Income tax deducted from wages paid. Consumption taxes on goods bought. It appears that you can even I'm not sure if that's taxes on these, tax these goods or exempt these goods from consumption taxes. I don't know. We'll see. Dividends taxes on profits made. Communism. That's literally communism. Clearly, according to Prager University, taxes on profits made is probably just communism. So yeah, communism confirmed in the game. Anyway, trade. Use your trading fleet. Does this mean that we have merchant marine capacity, or transports are required for the little trade to work? Question mark. I have no idea. I hope so. I would like to see a merchant marine mechanic. A bit like convoys in Hearts of Iron 4. To import and export goods with allies and rivals alike. Export goods, you have a competitive advantage to manufacture, and import resources you lack or manufactured goods your people need. Imperialism, basically. Trade routes can be mutually beneficial or aggressive. I don't know. I just like how trade routes can be aggressive. It's like herder, we are bad people, and we're gonna have an aggressive trade or whatever. I don't know. Economic system. This is one of the one of the replacements for the reforms, and I suppose the like political party economic ideology, the planned economy, state capitalism, laissez-faire that you had in Victoria too. And you can basically just like enact agrarianism, mercantilism, isolationism, traditionalism. Now, what the fuck the difference between traditionalism and agrarianism is, and also, to be fair, isolationism, you're going to need to be explaining those to me, as in my brain, those are all pretty fucking similar. Do they mean that like agrarianism is like physiocracy? Question mark. Do they mean it's like Georgism? Question mark. Yeah, like in my view, traditionalism is like, I don't know, people work farms, right? Therefore, kind of similar to agrarianism. And at this, also isolationism, conceptually it's different, but functionally it's very similar, because in an isolationist economy, you're going to have a lot of people growing food. That's just how it works, you know what I mean? And like extracting raw materials. Yeah. And you're going to be eschewing, I don't know how that verb is pronounced, sort of the general productivity of the system in favor of, more control and more local production of things, even if producing those things locally isn't necessarily 100% ooga booga, brain small, efficient. And then you've got your free trade, your mercantilism, which is also, it's not isolationism, and it's not agrarianism, and it's not traditionalism, but it sometimes results in those things, because mercantilism is basically when the country is basically prioritizing the protection of certain national industries and national agriculture. But whatever. Mercantilism itself is a very complex subject, so yeah, whatever. I am not equipped to explain mercantilism to people, and I will not try. Then you got your free trade and your command economy. Communism confirmed. Command economy. It's like, do this. I love how there's like a little looking glass into a factory. It's like the evil eye of the state has set itself onto this free enterprise. Ugh. Anyway, imports are penalized under mercantilism. Isolationist countries aim for self-sufficiency. Juche. Under free trade, public investments are plentiful, but subsidies are limited. Obviously, bootstraps and all that. Yeah, it's a good thing neoliberalism hasn't been invented yet, because you could do both of those things with neoliberalism, and the result is the destruction of society. I don't know. Conclusion. Your economy is not only your country's engine, but also shapes your population. Access to cheap resources and capital markets influences diplomacy. All actions reverberate throughout the economy, creating new economic and political challenges. I see red flags. Paris Commune, confirmed. I don't know. Yeah, I am and this is the end of the thing. How long have I been recording this? 58 minutes. Yeah, that's it. I also had like a couple other things that I could look at. For example, the world map. Let's just like very, very quickly look at the world map that's been leaked or something. I don't know. You can see that like a lot of countries have this like yellowish/white color. For example, the Kazakhs over here, but like also most of Africa. With colored borders. Those are the famous like tribal / unorganized stateless societies. I don't know. Like the Kazakhs were like a tribal nomadic horde. Yeah, but they decided to just make them, a tribe or whatever. yeah, basically pre-large scale state organization. Yeah, there's the so-called sort of unorganized states. Now, they've also replaced the uncivilized nations with so-called unrecognized powers. That would be your Sokotos, your Persias, your Qing, your Japan at the start of the game, your Korea. I like how Korea kind of looks like it's part of China? Question mark. That might be because it's a puppet at the start of the game. I'm guessing at least it's going to be a puppet. You can see a ton of trading routes all over the place. Which is kind of cute. I like it. Yeah, I don't know. And I just my brain just exploded when I saw Tibet. Unfortunately, it also looks like the British Raj is not as complex, or the British Raj, the East India Company is. Oh, it does look like it's the East India Company. You can just barely see the name over there over Bengal is the East India Company. Hell yeah. Damn, that's great. It's not literally a part of Britain like in Vanilla Victoria 2, so you can actually play as the East India Company. Holy shit. That would be so based. I wonder if you're gonna be forced to get annexed by them. I don't know. My brain just exploded when I saw Tibet. I was like, nice China borders, big China, because those were still the big China borders. Nice Ottoman borders. Overall, nice looking map from above, and I love how the fonts and the color scheme looks, and also how you've got these prints in the sea of the boats, and your compass. Yeah, I like that. I love that, actually. I love how there's a scale down here because, yeah, this looks like a map that was produced, when sort of some principles of cartography had already been established. So it's got a bit of that vibe. Yeah, I'm liking also South America, how Argentina is kind of more realistic, because all of Patagonia is not colonized, and also Guarani, the Guarani tribes are still sort of hanging out over there. You've got your horrible border gore with your tiny Chile, your mega Bolivia, weird Peru. I wonder if there's going to be Peru, Bolivia, and, your little Amazon weirdness. And, yeah, FRCA Yucatan is free at the start. What the fuck? I don't know. And there's also a bunch of Native Americans that are still hanging around. I wonder exactly why the Oregon Territory at the beginning is British, but whatever. Let's hope that you don't need to fight Britain every time if you're the USA. Yeah, I like the map. It's good. We also have the mega info dump of the that I mentioned in the comments of my last video of the guy who's got to see the alpha build or whatever, and who wrote the IGN article. This is a gigantic fucking info dump, but I guess we're gonna take a look at that some other time, because yeah, there's a shitload of stuff, and this video would run another hour if I did that. So yeah, for now, thank y'all for watching. Hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you soon.